Right. Okay.
Good news. Good news. Good news.
Hi, it's Brian Rose, and welcome to London Real. If you're listening to this podcast, it means that you're excited about learning and creating real change. Well, me too. That's why I started broadcasting this show 8 years ago. And over that time, I've learned that change only happens when you take action. Maybe you've been thinking about what steps you could take in order to live a better life, but you're feeling stuck or don't know where to start. I understand, and that's why I created the London Real Academy, to help people take that first step towards everything from starting their own business to recording their first podcast, to speaking publicly, or just to leading a healthier, more productive lifestyle. And today, I'm offering you a free one-to-one phone call with one of my London Real Academy coaches, who can speak with you directly about your personal challenges and how we can help. There is no cost for this and no obligation. So if you're ready to take action, go to londonreal.tv/change or click on the link to book your free coaching call and start your journey today. Now, on to the show. The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go? This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so shall you be. Most of modern cities and life is designed to avoid the fact that death exists. People don't see it anymore the way I did as a child. Death is a telephone call from a doctor. A lot of what we see in this crisis now is the triumph of fear. People are afraid, and people like being afraid more than they're prepared to admit, and also people like being told what to do more than they're prepared to admit. Freedom's not that popular. Fear is not as disliked as people like to let on. The great thing about religion is that it took fear out of politics and out of society. Again, Edmund Burke, a man who truly fears God will fear nothing else. And one of the things about a religious view of the universe is that you understand that what you do here matters somewhere else. If you genuinely believe, or can persuade yourself that it's enough of a likelihood to bet on, that death is not the end, then your concerns will be wholly different. Once that idea has gone, and I think the 20th century in Western countries has more or less killed the idea that death is not the end and that God is supreme in the universe. Death is not the end. Justice is worth fighting for.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Peter Hitchens, the British journalist, author, and political commentator. You write a weekly column for the world's most visited news website, the Mail Online, and have previously contributed to a range of publications across the political spectrum, including The Spectator, The American Conservative, The Guardian, and The New Statesman. You published 9 books, including The Abolition of Britain, The Rage Against God, and The War We Never Fought, and have been awarded the Orwell Prize in Political Journalism and Columnist of the Year at the British Press Awards. For the past 6 months, you've been a vocal critic of both the government's pandemic response and the fear-mongering of the mainstream press, calling for an end to the panic that is stifling this great nation of ours. Peter, welcome to London Real.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I should point out, by the way, that the column I write is written actually for the newspaper, the Mail on Sunday, which Mail Online then publishes online, but it is actually written for the newspaper.
Okay, excellent. Good. Just before we started, I just wanted to tell everybody that we're streaming now on our Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and it's available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Just want to ask everybody watching now to share this link on their social media and just, ask people to give us 15 minutes and then they can decide. Peter, I pledge to you and everybody watching this that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anybody in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at freedomplatform.tv/Hitchens. Thanks to the generous donations of 38,000 people around the world. Also, if anybody wants to become a founding member, they can go to freedomplatform.tv/give to fight with us on the front lines to protect our human right for freedom of speech. London Real, we had a platform for free speech since 2011, and I'm excited to have you here today. I had an incident this morning I wanted to get your thoughts on. I walked my son, Caden, who's 4 years old, to his very first day of school. And as you can imagine, he was nerve-wracked a little bit to go to a new place. But we got there, and the teachers are wearing these plastic visors, and I was asked to put on rubber gloves, and then I had to put on a mask. And when he's trying to understand what's happening, he's looking at his father, and he can't understand my expressions. And I'm thinking he's going to grow up in this world where, he can't see expressions on people's faces, that maybe we fear that other people are infecting us. And I just thought to myself, wow, this is not the world I want him to grow up into. And so I wanted to ask you, what is your take on everything that's happened the past 5 months? You seem to see this coming. I saw an interview with you and Piers Morgan on March 31st, and you had already seemed to understand kind of what was happening. But what are your thoughts on what's happened here and what we need to do to change this whole narrative?
This is what happens when incompetent people panic. We have, partly because of the degradation of the education systems of most Western countries in the past 50 years, and for other reasons as well, we have a political class which is composed of undistinguished people who know very little, who have very little experience, and who, when confronted with any kind of crisis, don't know what to do. On this occasion, they were advised strongly by people that they should take extreme and disproportionate measures, and they didn't have the sense to say no. And having made this grotesque mistake, which they must now understand was a mistake, particularly economically, but also politically, they are afraid to admit it. And the only thing to do is for them to continue with it almost endlessly, as far as I can see. And my task and the task of my trade ought to be to make them admit the mistake, because until the mistake is admitted, we will continue. For instance, it is undoubtedly the case that the disease, COVID-19 or whatever you wish to call it, has killed large numbers of people, and is obviously very unpleasant if you get it, and nobody should minimize it. But it simply did not justify the scale of the measures which were taken against it, and some of the measures which were taken seem to have made it worse, especially for old people in care homes, who it appears have died in unnecessarily large numbers because of mistakes made. And I think that these things need to be considered. But the thing which I've said from the beginning is that this action was out of proportion, and disproportionate actions are taken in panic. And panics are what happen when you're being run by people who don't really know what they're doing. And that's been fundamentally my understanding from the beginning. And I've carried on saying it. And I will carry on saying it as long as I may. And I will carry on saying it until the point is reached, either where my cause is defeated and there's no further point, or a substantial number of people in politics and the media and the academy and everywhere else come round to the same view. And there is an inquiry in which the government is condemned for its folly, and the people responsible are sent off into the obscurity which they so deeply merit. And that's all we can do. And in a free society, though it's the freedom society, one of the bizarre outcomes of this, the freedom society in which we live is diminishing all the time, and it's one of the most disturbing aspects of it. And there is an almost constant brewing of fear, and out of fear, power is distilled. I think it's ridiculous to try and say that there was any kind of plan to achieve any of this, but I think a number of people have rather enjoyed the amount of power that has come their way as a result of it, and don't, at the moment, have any plans to give it up. bizarrely, the most extreme examples of this have been in the Anglosphere countries, which are supposedly the most protected by Magna Carta principles and Bills of Rights and general protections of freedom. And yet you look at Victoria in Australia, and it's under what looks very much to me like a despotism at the moment, with people confined to their homes and police rounding up protesters and visiting the homes of people who support protests and handcuffing them. It's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it in my life, and I've seen some pretty strange things in quite a long life and a lot of traveling.
I think it was Rahm Emanuel, who I think was one of Obama's advisors, later became mayor of Chicago, who said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Although I'm sure he quoted.
I think it's been a long-standing view.
Yeah.
It's undoubtedly the case. If there's a crisis, that's the time to do the things you've longed to do for a long time. But that would be paying too much of a compliment, I think, to the people who sit in the government of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, who are fundamentally intellectually undistinguished persons, who I don't think had any particular plan, and they just floundered. They just got it wrong, and now they double down on their mistake.
I remember when they were easing the lockdown, and it just wasn't happening very fast, and I thought, this couldn't be just to cover up a bad decision that was made 3, 4, 5 months ago, because it seems like they could just reset things and say,
No, it doesn't work, because it's very easy, and there are documents from the fascinating one from the SAGE committee, the government's advisory committee of the scientists, right back on March 22nd, a paraphrase. It basically says people aren't scared enough, we need to scare them more. And that's what they then did on March the 23rd, when we were all ordered to stay at home and put under effective house arrest. And once you have set fear in motion, it's like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. You can't stop it. People are afraid. Now, for whatever reason it is, and I wouldn't like to say, this has never affected me in the slightest. I always thought the thing was an absurd over-response. But a lot of people I know, and these are people who are, in many cases, extremely well-educated, experienced in life, are completely paralyzed with fear of this thing. Yeah. They really think it's going to get them. And these are not fools. And then again, you will come across, for instance, I visited a small shop a couple of weeks ago, and the shopkeeper said, "You can't come in here without a mask." And I said, "Well, excuse me, I'm exempt from wearing a mask." He said, "Not here, you're not. My kids come in here." He said, "This is my home." As if his children were at terrible risk for me breathing out a disease I don't have in his shop. He genuinely believed it. And this is the thing that is disturbing. I mean, I didn't mind particularly. I could always go to another shop. The thing which worried me about the encounter was he and some of his customers who joined in the discussion genuinely believed that they were at great danger of contracting a deadly plague-type disease, much like the 1918 influenza epidemic. And they really, really thought that. Even after all these months, they still thought so. And that's where we are. Once you've brewed up that fear, it doesn't go away. You can't readily come. There's only one thing which would dispel it, and that would be an admission of error by the people who originally set it up. If they said we were wrong from the start, this was all a stupid mistake, that would dispel it, but nothing else will, and that's the one thing they won't do.
And that fear it's being used as a weapon, and we've seen that being used throughout history, but it's a way to change the entire freedom of a country. Even in a place like China, we see that being used.
Well, but no, the countries in which you and I have grown up are exceptions.
Yeah.
Most people's countries, there's a Hobbesian bargain. The government sets itself up as the people's protector in return for having an enormous amount of authority over them. In the Anglosphere countries, uniquely, this wasn't so. In the Anglosphere countries, there was a large measure of genuine freedom. The government stayed out of people's lives, and everything was legal unless it was specifically made illegal. In other countries, it was quite evident. When I lived in the Soviet Union, everything was illegal unless it was specifically stated to be legal. It was the exact opposite way around. There's a middle bit in the other continental countries, which have sort of got carefully designed democracies, but they really don't have the levels of freedom which we have. I mean, for instance, in Germany, a very free and well-run country in many ways, it's illegal to educate your children at home. And you have to register with the police before you can be connected to the electricity supply. So there are variations of this, which to an English person brought up in my era are absurd and oppressive. But for most people, there is the Hobbesian bargain. We protect you. In return, you must give us authority over you. And the really peculiar thing is this is now extending to countries which have spent centuries boasting that they didn't actually have to undergo it. And now we may have a terrific row in this country about whether the song "Rule Britannia," Britain's never, never, never shall be slaves, can be sung at a concert. Well, who cares whether it can be sung? The question is it true?
Do you think we wouldn't be having that discussion if it wasn't for the lockdown?
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, it's a different thing. I find it's banal. And if anyone hasn't yet realised that the British Broadcasting Corporation is an organ of the cultural left, then they're very slow on the uptake. They've been trying to get rid of patriotic songs from the last night of the prom since 1969.
Let's talk about the media a little bit then.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not. It's just the things that people are surprised about and worried about, and the things that they're unsurprised about and unworried about, always astonishing. Just like Michael Kinsley's great statement: the shocking thing is always not what's illegal, what's legal.
You know, you mentioned really quickly Australia and some of the measures happening there, these like kind of draconian measures. When you look at America, I mean, what do you see that stands out for you? And do you ever see some of these measures going back? Because again, this is, land of the free, home of the brave. This is, like you said, that bargain that they have with the people, but we don't see that happen.
I lived for 2 years in the United States, and I ended up more confused about it at the end than I was at the beginning. It seemed to me to be a country fundamentally German in ethos, but British in rules. And the ethos is always in conflict with the rules, but it has. I think there is a quite deep reservoir of authoritarianism in the United States, which is only kept at bay, actually, by the Constitution on some occasions and by the Bill of Rights. And it didn't surprise me anything like as much as Australia surprised me. And Australia is supposed to have this sort of rebellious spirit and be a country of people who don't stand for much, and yet it's ended up being probably the most, Victoria in Australia anyway, the single most repressed place in the Anglosphere.
And so America doesn't surprise you as much.
I wasn't as surprised. If I hadn't lived there, I would have been more surprised. But in fact, you get used to it. There's always been alongside the liberty, there's always been a very heavy-handed side of authority. There's semi-militarized police forces and the iron bureaucracy that you come up against. People always used to laugh about Soviet bureaucracy, but American bureaucracy has quite a lot to be said against it too. And it is, to me, it has a very, and in the armed services, particularly a very Germanic feel as well.
Yeah, I could probably comment a bit more of that as I think about it. We talked about weaponization of fear, and we've seen how that has been taken and being used against what normally would be very intelligent people able to make intelligent decisions about their biology. But it's also kind of the weaponization of data. I mean, we're seeing this whole narrative around testing, and who's testing positive as opposed to who's dying. And we see it a lot in America. We're seeing it a lot here. We're seeing it with these quarantines and things like that. What's going on here?
Well, I don't know what's going on. It's a failure. Again, it's a failure of intelligence on the part of the people who are supposed to examine these things. It's perfectly obvious, isn't it? If you test more, you'll get more results. So I had to write a story in my Mail on Sunday column a few weeks ago. The city of Leicester was being closed down again because supposedly it had more infections. So I rang up the relevant authorities and I said, "Excuse me, but have you been setting up more testing centres?" And they said, "Oh yes." In the week before the test figures had gone, they'd opened, I think, 8 more testing centres in Leicester, which is not that big a city. And later on, the week after that, they were actually going around knocking on people's doors from door to door, asking them whether they wouldn't mind being tested. The same thing happened in my own hometown of Oxford a couple of weeks ago. I think 40 people in a city of a population of 150,000 were said to be infected, a word carefully crafted to conceal the fact that they're almost certainly not ill, were said to be infected. And this level of infection was supposed to be so dangerous that it was an amber alert, and if it got much worse, then there would be a red alert and we'd all be forced to stay at home or whatever it was that they would come up with. And I knew of people who were being written to and then texted on their telephones, saying, will you please come and be tested? And Oxford already has one quite large test centre, and they opened another one. And even despite all this, they couldn't get enough people to get their red alert on this occasion. But it seemed to me that the suspicion that they wanted to get the figures up couldn't be avoided.
Being used politically, being used to cover tracks.
You just need to ask. I mean, it just doesn't take a huge application of intelligence or mathematics to say, if you test more, you'll get more positive tests. But what does it mean? What are those positive tests? Are these people ill? Does it matter? Is it comparable to the parallel figures, wholly different in many ways, mathematically and medically, that we had back in March or April, where in fact there was hardly any testing going on, but the figures for positive tests were higher. And why was that? You just need to look at it again. And a correspondent of mine made some graphs showing the contrast between the numbers of tests and the numbers of deaths. And the relationship between these two in March and April is completely different from the relationship now. So the tests are showing something different, but the authorities and much of the media, especially the BBC, behave as if these test figures mean the same as they would have done in March or April. And they use them to speak as if, to have a discourse which suggests that this means we must once again go back into a restrictive way of life.
What about the test itself? Because as we learn more about this PCR
I know
test,
nothing about it. I can't talk about it. I just simply know nothing about testing. I've heard people say that it's not reliable. Well, they may be right. I don't know. But let's assume for the purposes of this that the test is reliable. Even if it is wholly reliable, or 99% reliable, or whatever you want, even if that is so, the fact is still the same. If you test more, you'll get more results. The question is, what do these results mean?
it's September now. It's going to get colder. We're going into the winter. We're going into flu season. The second wave is on everyone's mind. What do you expect as a narrative to look out for? Or what do you see potentially happening with not only lockdowns, the economy, testing, et cetera?
Well, one has to worry. There is many years in this country, and I think in most countries there is a winter flu crisis of some kind or another in hospitals. There have been quite serious ones in recent years in which tragically large numbers of people, often older people with comorbidities, have died. And it's perfectly possible this will happen again. I think we should just be very vigilant to make sure that and under these circumstances, who's going to be particularly spending an awful lot of time deciding what these people have got? We've already had, back in March, April, May, a very lax system of classification of which deaths were listed as COVID-19. In fact, indeed, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jenny Harris, admitted at a government press conference these are deaths with COVID, not necessarily of. And though she said it, most of the reporting of it never actually took that into account. We may well be in a situation where there are deaths of people who are classified as of being with COVID, but which are not deaths of it. I just would ask my media colleagues to be a good deal more vigilant than they have been so far. And I would ask the public to be more vigilant on this. Don't necessarily accept that what you're being told is accurate, because it often isn't. A lot of these statistics are actually misleading. And why this is, I'm not going to speculate, but it's demonstrable that they are. And if someone as senior and distinguished as Dr. Jenny Harris is prepared to say that with and of mean a different thing, then it's obviously a significant fact which responsible people need to take into account.
Yeah, we've seen like the CDC in America, depending on what you believe, saying that only 6% of those numbers were actually accurate or fully COVID, and then the UK changed their numbers of the
There was a change
deaths.
in numbers recently, but that was due to a timing issue. But they did have to reduce the numbers. There's a big problem here. An awful lot of the people who are most vocal in criticizing these events are anti-vaxxers, people who believe that Bill Gates is trying to take over the world, people who believe there's a plot to force us all to be vaccinated. let them think and say what they wish, but they are a terrible nuisance to the cause because there are sensible criticisms of this to be made, which have nothing to do with any of those things, which they obscure. And there was a demonstration in London the weekend before last, and it was dominated by such people. And there were, no doubt, serious people with normal concerns there. But these zealots destroy the power of protest by, as it were, getting in the way. I would only say to them that they really have to understand just how much a complacent government rejoices every time they come out and dominate the debate about this. I would so wish that they would go away and leave it to people who have sensible, factual, researched objections to what's going on. It's been a disaster for dissent that these people have clustered around in.
Because the anti-vaccine people trigger a whole response, which is they must be crazy and everything they're saying is crazy. So let's talk about the science.
We could argue about vaccinations, but I'm not going to. The fact is that there are in the world quite a lot of people who are obsessed with things, who are fanatical about them, and who are not terribly particular about facts. And as soon as they appear on the stage next to you, then you've had it, because while you're explaining, as James Carville once said, you're losing. While you're saying, look, I'm not these people, I'm not the same. All of the television watching millions see is that you're sharing a platform with nutcases and your cause is lost.
Right.
And it's been a disaster. I just beg them to stay away.
I think you're referring to the protest that happened in London a week and a half ago, or 2 weeks ago.
No, it was the Saturday before last.
Right. And that was technically originally maybe a protest against masks, lockdown measures, but it ended up being maybe co-opted by lots of different groups.
Well, they said, you have a demonstration. But there were people on the platform who were, I think, tending in that direction, and of course, banners and flags in the crowd. From which you can't then dissociate yourself. And it was a shame, because the fundamental message that people are getting extremely worried about their loss of both personal liberty and economic future and all the rest of it was destroyed by it, because there were important things to be said, and normal concerned human beings could have been at that demonstration, and they would have possibly felt themselves a bit uncomfortable there.
An arrest was made. Pierce Corbyn was arrested.
Well, the arrest was afterwards, but it's the fascinating thing about the arrest was it was made on the basis of a law which had been made about 24 hours before the demonstration began, and a law which had been made not by Parliament, by what I was taught through all my childhood and school days, the process of green paper, white paper, first reading, second reading, committee stage, House of Lords revision, back to the Commons. All that didn't happen. A minister, who I think is mainly qualified as being a former computer software salesman, issued a decree. And at some point in the next 2 or 3 weeks, Parliament will retroactively vote to approve it on the basis of a law made in 1984 to deal with quarantines for diseases. Now, here's a fascinating thing. In all the history of mankind, quarantine has been about confining the sick to prevent them from infecting the healthy. For the first time ever, as far as I know, in human history, we have a quarantine which confines the healthy. Never been done before. So the legal basis of this, the 1984 Public Health Act, is very skimpy. And if we had a proper functioning Parliament, and frankly, if we had properly vigilant courts, I think this would already have been substantially challenged, but we don't. And also, we don't seem to have, for the most part, a questioning media. So again, it just happens. Parliament in this country is dead. I call it the dead parrot parliament. It's dead because it does nothing. It's a parrot because it repeats what the government tells it to.
And you wrote in detail in your column yesterday, I think, about this. And as you said, they can kind of concoct this legislation with they don't have to explain it. It doesn't have to be debated, and it can happen. And under lockdown, there were many laws and acts that were created
again, day after day after day. Out they came, and they were changed almost willy-nilly. And it's government partly by decree and partly as as Lord Sumption, a former Supreme Court judge here, has said, partly by televised press conference. This is not a functioning law-governed democracy anymore. This is a tin pot television despotism.
Now contrast that protest to the other protests we saw weeks ago with Black Lives Matter protests. Were those treated differently because of politics, ideology?
The new law had not been made at that time. The law which enabled a police officer of no rank at all to impose a fine of £10,000, a substantial sum, on Piers Corbyn. Now, that law didn't exist then. I think that there are criticisms to be made of the lack of even-handedness of the policing of various different types of demonstration. Yes, but that particular law was made, and you can draw whatever conclusions you like, that was made 24 hours before the demonstration to which it was first applied.
Right, and I watched some of those speeches given in Trafalgar, and I was shocked to see him pulled away by police after, because I didn't see any causation or correlation between what he said.
And no doubt he would have gone perfectly quietly fast as well. It's you look at this and you see the events in Melbourne and in Australia over the weekend. The extraordinarily heavy-handed policing of a quite small demonstration in a war memorial park in Melbourne. Look at this. What is this? It doesn't look like a free society.
And when you see...
Looks like Belarus, actually.
Yeah, well, yeah. It looks like Belarus, yeah. And when you see that, but when you see also, for example, a protest from the left where do you think those are not being enforced? Do you think there are double standards that's being accused of happening in the States? For example, Black Lives Matter versus protesting lockdown.
I think there are criticisms to be made, yes, but there hasn't. The protesting against the lockdown is quite recent. The Black Lives Matter and the pulling down of statues is older. I think there has been a police feebleness towards certain causes for some time. And that's partly because the police in this country have very much been captured by the Cultural Revolution, particularly in the past 10 years. And they tend to be led by people who have pretty radical ideas and who are not necessarily unsympathetic to Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion or other causes. And so that's not new in British terms. The revolutionizing of the police, something I've written about a lot, has been a very long process. And the installing, for instance, of Dame Cressida Dick as head of the Metropolitan Police was a clear sign. There was nothing conservative anymore about the police force, that it is now a politically radical body. And it believes very much in the precepts of what, for the lack of a better phrase, we have to call political correctness. So it naturally finds it harder to be tough on bodies such as Extinction Rebellion or Black Lives Matter than on outfits that it would regard as right-wing.
What did you make of the Extinction Rebellion blockade of printing here in the UK?
Well, I'm shocked to find some people defending it. I had some arguments on social media about it on Saturday.
A few MPs tweeted out support and then deleted
deleted it, yes. Well, I mean, that's anybody who does that, well, you've got their measure, haven't you? If you mean it, stick to it. It's simultaneously idiotic and gutless is not a good look, is it? But there were people saying it was just a protest, and I said, well, no. If you're trying to prevent the distribution of newspapers, it is an act of censorship, and it is one of the things which, when newspapers were more powerful, one of the things which despotic bodies did was, of course, to prevent their distribution. I seem to remember Indira Gandhi, when she was having her authoritarian period as Prime Minister of India, shutting down, I think cutting off the electricity to the offices of newspapers in Delhi, which opposed her. Similar sort of action. But that was a government. And here are people who want to influence the government, in some cases may end up in government, who don't see anything wrong in preventing the distribution of newspapers with which they disagree. It seems to me undeniable that they'd chosen the printing plant which produced the newspapers with which they disagreed most. So it's obvious an act of censorship. It was not an act of protest. So they wanted to protest, they would stand outside the newspapers. They can march in the streets, but blocking the distribution is preventing the spreading of the contents of the newspapers is a form of censorship and suppression of free speech. And I don't see how anyone can argue differently. And it's just plain wrong.
Let's talk about censorship a little bit. I think you said once that what I did as a revolutionary socialist is try to keep people from exercising their freedom of speech. This was always a tactic of, say, the left in the past.
Well, it's not just the left. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, what is called, what people mostly associate with the right now, the German National Socialism, was certainly a great suppressor of free speech as well. But I think it's a tactic for utopians. The Nazis were racialist utopians. I don't believe they were conservatives. You could say they were of the right in some ways. It's a complicated question because in a lot of what they did was quite actually similar to what communist parties were doing elsewhere in the world. But there's some striking similarities in their propaganda and in youth movements and indeed in some of the economic things they did. But it's leaving that argument aside for a moment. It's utopians who are always the threat because utopians believe that they're so good and their objectives are so wonderful that anybody who disagrees with them is not just wrong, but bad. And therefore it is legitimate, first of all, to suppress what they say, and ultimately to kill them, which is why, as I also say, utopia can only ever be approached across a sea of blood, and you never arrive.
So briefly, those sounded like technology companies you were talking about, but talk to me about freedom of speech. You know, look, you write for the Mail Online or the column that goes on the Mail Online, and we know searching that is difficult. We know a lot of major social media platforms are censoring certain content. You were asked recently for a publication you write for in America to kind of change your views or write something different.
Tone down, I think would be the polite way of saying to tone down my criticism of the response to COVID. This is by a very nice, largely Roman Catholic American magazine called First Things, for which I've written for some years. I've had a lot of fun writing for them. They're very nice people. And I wrote a column for them in which I made a small parallel between the reaction to cholera in the 19th century in Oxford, where the governing body of Christ Church, one of the richest colleges, actually built walls on either side of a stream to try and stop the cholera getting out. And I was making the point, this is a similar absurdity to much of what we were doing now. And the reaction came back, could I alter it a bit this way and that? And I said, well, no. And so that was the end of our relationship. And I've gone public about it because I think people should know. Much more important, by the way, is what's happening to Sunetra Gupta, the Oxford epidemiologist, very distinguished, a woman of the left, by the way, not of my politics, but she has taken a different view from the British government on the response to COVID-19, and she revealed in an interview with the London Evening Standard last week that she's now finding it difficult to get published in medical journals, in scientific journals, and this is, to me, much more shocking than what happened to me. But there is a general darkening. The cause of supposedly stamping out the coronavirus has now become so dominant and presumed to be so vital that all kinds of principles which would previously have governed life are being thrown to one side. It's extraordinary. But utopianism is abroad, and it's always dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, for 9 years, I streamed conversations just like this every single week, and it wasn't until April of this year when guests started asking questions, similar to what you're saying right now, that YouTube started demonetizing and then deleting and potentially throwing my content off the platform. And my example was, there's people that believe the earth is flat. Bless them, I don't. But their videos are allowed to be on YouTube because they say as an adult you can entertain those opinions. But if I want to have someone in the chair that is going to question why we're looking at the numbers of COVID tests or anything against what the WHO says, including masks wearing, YouTube told me that goes against their policies and it will be taken down. So, I mean, that's a massive form of censorship.
Yes, the extraordinary thing is they're not embarrassed about it.
No.
This is what makes me so worried. The whole thing about free speech, where I grew up and where I was educated, was that actually, yeah, we are in favor of it. And when I was a Bolshevik in my late teens and early 20s, and when I tried to suppress the freedom of speech of others, I knew perfectly well I was doing something really transgressive, which was considered extremely wicked. And what was interesting in those days, the late 60s and early 70s, was that an awful lot of people in the academy stood up to us and said, how dare you? Are you some kind of Nazis? And we said, no, we're socialists. We believe in. And they said, well, you're behaving like the other lot. And they fought us.
This is where in Britain,
quite rightly so, yes. There's a very good novel about campus leftism and the whole Cultural Revolution called The History Man by Malcolm Bradbury, in which an incident is described almost identical to one in which I took a very wicked part. It's the thing, I look back on my left-wing time with very mixed feelings, but the thing of which I'm unequivocally ashamed is those attempts I made to suppress freedom of speech. I knew at the time that what I was doing was bad, but I thought that bad things were justified by my good end.
Right.
That was the trap into which I'd fallen. It's the utopian trap. I knew it's bad, but I still did it. But the thing about these people who try and censor the internet now is that they don't even think what they're doing is bad. And nobody stands up to them except marginal figures like me, who don't count for a row of beans at the moment.
It's very hard to stand up to these companies.
Well, they just they go over you. It's like an ant standing up to a tank. Brave ant.
Well, tell me about your journey from, not from the left to the right, because that's too general, being general, but it gives you very interesting insight from the fact that you spent time in the past, like you said, in this cultural revolution, suppressing freedom of speech, and now you're over on the right. So you know their thought patterns, their tactics, not they, but those tactics.
Yeah, I do. And that's why they hate me so much, I think. But I wouldn't have missed it for the world. I can't, in all honesty, look back on it and wish I hadn't done it, because it gave me a depth of education about the world that I wouldn't otherwise have. And I have to say, anybody who's never used Marxist categories and has never examined a society in a Marxist fashion probably will never properly understand the nature of power in politics. And most of the people I've known who've been most effective in politics have had at least a brush with it. So I don't regret it from that point of view. And fortunately, I got out of it before I'd done any serious harm to anybody politically. Though generally I was quite a badly behaved person at that time. So it's been useful to me. I think if people would only listen to me a bit more, it could be quite useful to society as well. But one of the problems with understanding things better than most people is you can't actually explain it to them, because they haven't had your experiences, they haven't done your traveling, they haven't lived where you've lived or seen what you've seen. They don't know what left-wing people are like in private. And so they won't believe you. So it's like being the guy in Invasion of the Body Snatchers trying to say, look, actually, no, this is really bad. And they're saying, no, don't worry about it.
You know, we've been talking a lot about British politics and policy, but when you look at America, I mean, it's almost kind of like the 10X version of this. At least that's what I see, where the left is no longer liberal. They've gone so far, it seems, to where Antifa is sometimes...
This is a fascinating thing about the left. I mean, you say what you like, for instance, about the Guardian, the principal British left liberal newspaper. Until about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, it could be relied upon, if there was an issue of free speech and civil liberties, to be on the right side. Whatever else you had against it, you know that if there was somebody who was being messed around by the courts in some unjust fashion, or if there was some lie being told by the government, the Guardian would be on the right side there. And now, not so. And in general, the left have been very much on the side of authority and the establishment here. I think that this is because the left have become the establishment, that their opposition to these things really arose from them being excluded and outsiders, rather than because of a principled desire to stand up for freedom. And it's a great shame. I miss the old Guardian a lot, and I look at it now and I think, well, what happened to you? You were so important and now you're not there. And it reminds me also of a very clever statement made by a man called Richard Neville, who set up, he was an Australian, came to England, he set up a magazine called Oz, which was a troublemaking, radical, often quite obscene magazine. And not my political ally, but he was certainly very bright. And he said back in the 1960s, there is an inch of difference in this country between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, but it is in that inch that we all live. But since then, that inch has closed. There is no inch. Parliament is no longer adversarial. The two parties don't actually genuinely fight each other over anything. And therefore, the inch in which we lived is gone. It's the adversarial nature of, particularly of British democracy, that was always so important, that the parties really were genuinely rivals. And once they ceased to be and became almost identical in politics, then the liberty of the rest of us just gone.
Wow. And when you see the left in America, where it seems like the alternative now is to destroy or cancel, as we've seen, where does that go from here? And will Britain trend more towards that way in the next 5 years?
I have no idea. I can't. I mean, the two countries are, the other thing you learn when you live in the USA is the two countries are hugely different. And particularly the United States, the left of the United States has a wholly different character, as indeed do conservatives. And the conservative tradition in America is, for instance, it's neither Anglican nor monarchist. So it tends actually much more, in my view, to be liberal in economics, for instance, and generally to be different. So it's very hard to apply American patterns to Britain or British patterns to America, and I try not to do it. But the bad news is coming in both jurisdictions, though, I think I can say without much.
And when you look at America with these, constant violent protests in most major cities, and
is it that bad? I mean, I don't know how widespread it actually is.
I know certain cities continue. It seems like the Portlands and some of the Minneapolises and some of the other ones seem to continue to have, from what I've seen, some of these nightly riots and the defunding the police calls.
But is this general? I mean, if I went to Des Moines or somewhere like that, would I find it going on? Or
that's a good question. Probably not.
This is the thing. I don't know how much I'm being told,
right.
What is actually going on, how much I'm being told exaggeration. I always remember when I was a correspondent in Moscow, all the newspapers and all the television channels in Britain got into their heads there was a famine in Moscow. And all the correspondents in Moscow kept saying, but there isn't a famine in Moscow. We really want a story about the famine. There is no famine in Moscow. But the story was that there was a famine in Moscow. And people began to crack, and they began sending in reports saying there is a famine in Moscow. They did, honestly.
Yeah, well.
I mean, that can happen. So I don't know. I do like to check with the original source sometimes before I believe everything that I hear.
All right, but you must watch some of what's happening.
Yeah, I do, and I think it's terrible, but I'm not sure how general it is and how just how big it is. I mean, here's the horrible things about New York City and Los Angeles, individual reports, which are obviously very serious and are deteriorations which would have been shocking when I was living there, but I just don't know how general it is.
Okay. You mentioned the BBC earlier. You used to be a proponent of the BBC or the concept of the BBC, not so much now.
Well, I still am a proponent of the concept of the BBC. Right. Because I think the idea of having a powerful organisation capable of providing high quality, high culture entertainment and good, impartial news coverage is an excellent idea. And I would support any attempt to create such a thing. But I've tried, both in personal actions and in entries to debate and all kinds of other ways, to achieve this. And I find that the BBC is wholly resistant to it. The BBC has decided that it is a law unto itself, that it can receive money in return for making a pledge it has no intention of keeping. And I've given up hoping that it will get any better. And I think its performance in the recent months, where its coverage of this has been shocking in its inadequacy, has persuaded me that I can no longer turn around and say to anybody broadly in my spectrum of society, I can no longer turn around and say to them, actually it's a good thing that the BBC is preserved, it's a good thing that the licence fee still exists, because I don't believe it anymore. I wish I could. I really wish I could, but there's no sign that the organisation is reformable. And with great regret, therefore, I've just decided that I can't anymore say that. I would love for there to be an organisation such as the BBC ought to be, but I don't believe the BBC will ever again be that organisation.
Is it simply towing the line of the government? Because
no, it's nothing like so simple. No,
it's not that simple.
No. It's the BBC recognises certain things that it's simple because it is an organisation of the and has been really since the middle 60s, an organisation of the cultural left, Bloomsbury on speed, basically. The BBC recognises things which are similar to itself. It loves the European Union, because that dinosaur, calling it a dinosaur across the swamp, it sees in the European Union a body similar to itself in nature and objectives. And I think it saw in the introduction to this country of a utopian attempt to control disease by centralizing government power. Again, it saw something that it liked, and it sided with it. Didn't need no prompting. It's instinctive.
And its funding is still potentially determined by the government.
With funding, it's a treaty. The government every 10 years makes a treaty with the BBC called the Charter, in which the level of the licence fee is negotiated, and in return the BBC gives a pledge, the Charter, an agreement in which it promises, amongst other things, to be an impartial provider of news and current affairs. And it just doesn't do that. But this has all gone down the gurgler now because because of the internet means increasing numbers of people can entertain themselves perfectly happily without ever actually watching the BBC. And the basis of the licence fee was always, which is a poll tax, was always that the BBC provided the basic television and radio services to everybody. It entertained the nation, it provided news to the nation, and therefore it was reasonable for the government to collect this fee on its behalf. But now an awful lot of people are not prepared to pay it. And in any case, they're getting their entertainment from Netflix or other streaming services, or they're watching programs on their phones or on their iPads or on their PCs or on their whatever it is they do. So the whole business where you owned a television set and therefore you paid a license fee is breaking down in practice as well as in theory. I think everybody now realizes it's unsustainable. The BBC is almost certainly going to have to go for subscription or advertising or some other form of income on top of a license fee, which is going to be increasingly difficult to collect. So its time is going anyway. I don't think it can in practice continue much longer.
10 years from now, will it?
Who knows? I mean, it's easy to predict the future in general. Much harder to say exactly when things are happening. You could, for instance, have seen probably that the Soviet Union would collapse because it was full of what we ex-Marxists would call irreconcilable contradictions. But you might have been, as most people were, totally astonished that it did so in 1991. Right. I think a lot of people would have given it another 30 years. Yeah. But in the end, when it went so fast.
Yeah.
And things do. Things can go really fast when they go.
And that could be...
But on the other hand, they can stick around for amazingly long time, long after they should have gone.
Do you think the BBC could compete with news organizations if it had to do so without government assistance or mandate?
No. It's not government assistance. It isn't like that. There is a grant in aid for some of the World Service operations, but the government raises money for the BBC, but it really isn't a government broadcaster, and it would be a mistake to characterize it as that. I know through an American money it looks like that, but it's the license fee system was designed to cut out any kind of direct paymaster relationship. But the government does act as the collector of the license fee, and that means that the two have to be on some sort of terms.
Yeah.
But devising a system for governing the BBC, and I've thought about it a lot, is very difficult.
You mentioned the collapse of the Soviet Union. Lessons to be learned today by watching that happen, especially from those that are on the left.
Oh, but the left have learned. The clever left learned an awful lot from the Soviet Union. Right back in the 1920s, Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian communist, understood that the Soviet system would never work in Western Europe or in an advanced country, and devised the revised form of communism, the capture of the culture, the capture of the school, the television studio, the university, the newspaper, the publishing firm, the capture of the whole mass of what people actually think and say as being the preliminary before the political and economic change. And that became Eurocommunism, and which was at its strongest in Italy, Gramsci's country. And a lot of the Trotskyism that I was involved in was beginning to grope towards this, because we could see that the Soviet Union wouldn't work. We were ashamed and appalled by what had happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968. You didn't have to be a conservative to disapprove of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. It was easy to see that it was wrong and stupid, and these uninspiring, heavy-footed men standing on top of Lenin's tomb in Red Square were not our idea of the future. And so all that was changing. And when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Berlin Wall fell, revolutionary Marxism was liberated. It wasn't defeated. It no longer had this great albatross of Leonid Brezhnev hanging around its neck, nor was it the ally of the great enemy in the Cold War. It was free, and it's been free ever since. And the idea that the left didn't learn from the Soviet Union is wrong. They learned a lot from it. A lot of them were, I think, pretty pleased to see it go. And they have been engaged in huge advances in radicalism since then. I remember the original communism was really the heir and inheritor of the French Revolution. It was much more a matter of political and moral and religious, anti-religious radicalism than it was a matter of nationalizing the nuts and bolts industry and setting up the KGB. And that's what it's returned to. This is why the ferment of atheism has become so strong. You can be an atheist without being a revolutionary, but you can't be a revolutionary without being an atheist.
Mm-hmm. Will we see a Marxist government come back?
Well, it won't be called that. I mean, in my view, this country had a Euro-communist government under Blair from 1997. His cabinet was full of people who were Trotskyists and ex-communists, none of whom had ever, as far as I can see, ever particularly recanted their revolutionary ideas. They just honed them to fit into the modern world.
I wanted to ask you about religion, but just shortly. Face masks, something you've been very vocal about. Tell me why. Why are those the things that you see so many issues with?
Well, it's not me that's been vocal about it. It's been the governments of the world have been vocal. They've suddenly, long after the major danger of epidemic was over, they've suddenly embarked on this curious program of making people, by the force of law and the threat of fines, don these curious garments. Things which they themselves have said in the past are not much use. I mean, I have a small treasury of British government quotes saying, actually, masks aren't much use, which they put in their own publications, which their own medical officers said. And then suddenly, right at the end of all this, when the number of deaths is tiny and the disease is plainly weakened enormously, and the evidence for these, particularly for those pale blue cloth masks you see everywhere, the evidence for a loose cloth mask, which is being constantly touched by its wearer, being effective against anything, is very slender. Suddenly there's this great campaign to impose on people. It must make, surely, a questioning mind a little bit suspicious as to what this is about. I think it has several purposes. One is to sustain the atmosphere of fear and alarm. The other, which disturbs me considerably, is that it seems to me that anyone who puts one of these things on is engaging in what I call compelled speech. Is to say, well, they are putting on a badge. By putting this on, you're saying, I submit. It's a very submissive act, covering your face and removing a large part of your personality. It's a servile thing to do. And you're saying to everybody else who sees you in the street, on the train, in the shop, I agree with this policy. I accept what the government says. It's an armband or a lapel badge, and it's worn, even worse, on the face. And I think it's very peculiar. It seems to be a kind of Milgram experiment. You know what I mean by that? The great California experiment where a group of people were persuaded by alleged scientists to give electric shocks to their fellow creatures on the grounds that they were taking part in some good experiment. In fact, the electric shocks weren't real, and the howls of pain from the subjects were faked. But people were prepared to press buttons, giving people quite large electric shocks on the instructions of scientists. And here in this country and all the other mask-wearing countries, people are prepared to put these masks on because the government tells them to, because they're told it's good. And it's been said, and I think there's something to this, that if the government suddenly announced a discovery that the COVID virus hovered at 3 feet 6 inches above the ground, and everybody had to go back on their hands and knees, I think these people would do the same thing. There'd be a huge market in knee pads.
And
They could all take the knee.
And what about the idea that it also prevents communication with facial expression?
Well, it does that too, but it is a huge sorrow to people with hearing impairments who have a really hard time because of it, I have to say. But obviously, it's an important issue, but it's not central to the politics of it. But there is a cancelling of the personality by the wearing of a garment which actually goes across the face, which I find quite disturbing. And is it not? If some group in society began to instruct its members to go around like that, what would Alexander Boris Pfeffel Johnson government have done about that?
Yeah, because it means I can't understand your emotions. It also means you're immediately perceived as a threat to me when I see that mask. It's that badge.
It's a threat. I think the person wearing the mask looks almost as if they're peering out from inside something. I won't say it's a captive thing. I find it both unjustified by any kind of real medical evidence and disturbing as a human act. And as with all kinds of other things, people say, why do you make such a fuss about it? An example, for instance, the metric system. I said, why do you make such a fuss about it? I said, I don't make a fuss about it. It's them making a fuss about it. I would have said nothing about this if the government hadn't suddenly started telling people they've got to wear them. Don't ask me why I'm obsessed about it. Ask the governments of all the Western countries why suddenly this extremely dubious alleged precaution is being pressed on people. I read the other day in a French newspaper of a French TGV on its way up from Aix-en-Provence, and the conductor announcing over the public address that not enough people were wearing face masks, so they were going to stop the train. So les services d'ordre, the police, could come on board and presumably drag off the non-compliers. Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
What should we all do as British citizens? Should we refuse?
Oh, dear. I'm not going to advocate law breaking.
But you'll break the law.
No, I'm not going to advocate law breaking, nor am I going to declare that I will myself break the law. No.
Okay.
No, I'm not. That's not the business that I'm in. I still believe in the rule of law, though it gets harder and harder to do as the law gets stretched and as its origins get so polluted by government by decree. But I think it really isn't for anyone in my position to advocate law breaking.
Tell me about the economy, something that gets lost sometimes in these discussions.
Completely lost. Yeah.
I've lived through a few economic crises, but nothing compared to, say, the Great Depression. Where does this rank in terms of potential severity, and how can people even fathom what it could be and what it means to them?
Well, the second question is makes it plain why it's so difficult to answer the first. Nobody really knows. Nothing like this has ever been attempted before. No government in peacetime has ever borrowed so much money from nowhere. And also, no government in peacetime has taken deliberate action to destroy so many industries and to destroy so many jobs, and then covered up its, what you might call its crime, by continuing to pay them with money that it has not got. Now, I know that sovereign governments, can create money up to a point, but unless they're autarkic and they're completely insulated from the outside world, there is a limit to this. And also, if that money starts to escape into the pockets of the general population, it has to be severely inflationary. So you have a combination of quite severe job losses in an economy not very well positioned because it has very little in the way of manufacturing left, not in a good position to regenerate itself, very reliant on the services which are precisely the things which have been most damaged by the shutdown, And then you also have an economy in which the city of London, by which I don't mean just the economic city, the banking and trading city, I mean the whole great city of London, is itself an engine room of the economy. And if that city is slowed down and ceases to function, and on my way here it was evident that the streets are still worryingly empty of people and traffic, and then it's as if a major industry has been shut down. And I can see nothing good. I hear the distant growl of Niagara Falls. And yet here I am, sitting in a boat controlled by a captain who doesn't seem to have any awareness of this, and is much more worried about a tiny alleged second wave of COVID for which there is actually no evidence.
And the regular citizen that says, I'm getting 80% of my wage, everything's going to be okay.
So far so good, as the man said as he went past the 32nd floor of the Empire State Building. I mean, it's so far so good. And the weather hasn't turned bad yet either, but it will. And the money runs out for the furlough payments. And there are all kinds of other people. I mean, people say, oh, who cares about landlords? Why should we worry about the fact they can't collect their rent? But an awful lot of people are landlords with quite small properties, and an awful lot of other people may not realize it, but they get their pensions from the rents paid to landlords. And if that stops, then that's also going to be a huge blow. It's just, even a basic understanding of economics seems to suggest that this is really bad. And what I will say to people, one experience I have had, is that catastrophes happen. You've probably seen the great Orson Welles film, The Third Man.
Yeah, I have.
You know the opening scenes in Vienna of people in respectable clothes standing by the roadside selling their possessions for money to buy food. Post-war Vienna does us. Well, I thought the first 4 or 5 times I saw that film, I thought, well, this is just a mythical past. And yet, when I was living in Moscow towards the end of the days of communism, I saw that. I saw middle-class people with little tables selling their possessions by the road to buy food. And these are people who, a few years before, had secure jobs, were secure in their apartments in central Moscow. Their children were sure of a reasonable education. They were living in a stable society. And suddenly everything, the whole bottom of their world had fallen out. And I was a privileged spectator. I could do nothing to help them. I could see this. What did I learn from this? I learned that catastrophes happen. And in some ways, the worst thing about them is that the huge rivers of fire don't pour from the sky. Not everybody dies. People survive. They live on. And after the catastrophe is over, you're still there, living your life as a ghost of your former self. And this is what I really fear.
And the people hit the hardest are actually the lower and middle classes with these big tax and spend programs.
The people in some ways hit the hardest will be the very people on whom a civil society relies most, the people who save.
Right.
And because it will be the inflation will destroy their savings, while at the same time they themselves and their children will lose jobs and education. And it is a matter of historical fact that when the middle class is destroyed in this way, instability, serious political instability, necessarily follows. And it scares me. There are some occasions when I'm quite glad that I'm nearly 70. But so what? I mean, I have children, I have grandchildren, and the world will continue to exist after I'm gone. I have to worry about it. And it's very frightening. I don't get any real sense that serious people are giving it serious consideration.
Yeah. Me neither. What about this mentality that, especially for Londoners, that this is the new normal, I'm going to work from home via Zoom, and everything's going to be fine, corporations are still going to work, and the UK as a country will continue?
This is not Londoners, this is the people who commute into London who do this, and who can blame them, because commuting, particularly with the state of our railroads, has been an ordeal for many people. They might want to be glad to be spared from it, but of course we know the true benefits of working in common with others are enormous in terms of exchange of experience, passing on experience, the sparking of ideas. And it can't last like this. And it won't last like this. And an awful lot of people will find also that they may think that there will be a new normal in which this will continue, but their employers won't be able to do so. And never has a better argument been made for 0 hours contracts instead of secure employment. And all those people who have established to their satisfaction that they can work without ever going near the office may well have established that to their employers' satisfaction as well. And you say, right, well, in that case, in future, you're on a contract. Why am I supplying this office, these facilities for you if you're not coming in? In future, I'll hire you when I need you and otherwise not. And it's a whole different way of life, as a lot of people have been discovering, younger people have been discovering, and this is going to be visited, I think, on the middle-aged, and they're not going to like it. I think it seems to me to be delusional to imagine that anything good is going to come out of this.
Become a country of freelancers, which changes the whole social
Quite,
fabric
yeah,
of everything.
it's not, it's a country, and therefore, of insecurity.
Yeah. I go through London and it depresses me. I just think we need to get this city back to work. I go through Camden, I see, stores shut down, homeless people. It's dead in the streets. And I'm being told everybody in the City of London financial district isn't coming back until 2021. We got a mayor that doesn't seem to have a plan. It's frustrating to watch. And it says, I think 41% of the income of the city is from people coming to offices. And
is it that much? I'm not at all surprised. All the sandwich bars and all the rest of it, and the shops selling whatever they need are suffering terribly. And I know shopkeepers, not in London, but in my own hometown of Oxford, who are suffering terribly from this and don't know really where the future is going to take them.
Yeah.
The economic damage is profound, and it's as if this is a patient who's had a major stroke and a major heart attack and should immediately have been rushed to hospital where specialists could take the maximum and fastest action to prevent further damage. And instead the patient has been left lying, untreated, with the damage going deeper. And then which of course raises the other question of all the people waiting for cancer treatment, for operations, who've had them postponed because of this. Shocking numbers of people who've almost certainly died because they didn't get adequate treatment, because the whole priority of the health service was switched and they were told they had to wait. And if people are concerned about saving life, which was the whole basis of the whole thing in the first place, then they should realize this. Right at the beginning, a brilliant German, now German-based, American-born scientist, Sucharit Bhakti, at the University of Mainz, predicted, he said, that there would be terrible effects on people who were ill, on people who relied on normal medical services, and on the healthy old, who would be isolated and made miserable. And he made a very powerful statement about this, which I tried to get maximum publicity for. And if you look it up, you'll find it's almost prophetic. Everything that he said would happen happened, and is still happening, and was preventable by responsible leadership, which we have not got.
Mm. One thing we've seen recently is stock markets hitting new highs and technology stocks getting new highs. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I would say if you look at an Amazon or a Google or some of these other companies, this is good business for them. So it seems that they might want to continue this state in some way.
I can't believe that, because the business of that kind is sustained on top of general prosperity. And if general prosperity goes, it doesn't take a PhD in economics to see that if general prosperity goes, then that goes too. I don't think so. No, I think stock markets are often crazy, and they have these, remember the dot-com bubble, they have these frenzies from time to time, and I think that this one where the stock market is entirely out of step with reality for the moment, and it's just exactly, we'll have to wait and see how it will fall into step again.
How does this all play out, do you think, Peter?
I have no idea.
Really?
I fear that it will go on forever.
Forever?
That's the way it feels to me at the moment. I see no exit. I see no sign of anybody who takes over. When it began, I said that what we were faced with here was a doctor confronted with a patient with a mild rash, saying to the patient, well, look, I can cure this rash as a miraculous new operation. I just have to cut off your right leg. And the patient, being of a trusting sort, so, well, of course, doctor, you know best. Yes, please, cut off my right leg. And the doctor cuts off his right leg, and the rash duly goes away. The doctor says, "It's fantastic. You see how wonderful it is? I cut off your right leg, your rash has gone away." And the patient says, "Oh, thank you, doctor." And the doctor then says, "And I now would like you to pay me a $50,000 bill for my services." And the patient says, "How am I going to do that? I've only got one leg." But the end of all this, if anybody complains, the doctor will say, "Well, his rash did go away. I cut off his leg. The operation worked." And this is what's going to happen. We're already being prepared for this. And the doctor will say, "And if only I'd cut off his leg earlier, the rash would have gone away more quickly." It's already being prepared. The argument is if when the inquiries are held, the government will say, "We should have locked down earlier. That was the mistake we made." And the inquiry will accept that. Because this closed circle of closed minds, which dominates all discussion of this in politics and the media and the academy, will all conclude that. And so we will then be ready and prepared for the doctor to come back and cut off our other leg.
Do you think 50 years from now we'll ever get a proper forensic inquiry into what happened?
It doesn't look like it at the moment to me. I used to think that it would be bound to happen. But there are other controversies in which I've been engaged to do with the attempt of the Western countries to intervene on the side of Al-Qaeda in Syria. One of the most bizarre episodes of modern diplomacy. But during that, it came to me that what the governments of the world had learnt, particularly the British and American governments, had learnt from the Iraq War, was not that it was stupid to engage in Middle Eastern wars, but that they hadn't managed to get the control of information right. If weapons of mass destruction were now not found in Iraq, then no one would report it. If the great exposure of the fact that the Iraq War was without a pretext would not take place because there isn't enough independent journalism or independence of mind in politics or diplomacy for it ever to come out, what they learned was to suppress the truth more effectively. They're very good at it. When they make a mistake, they will never admit it. It will not come out.
Right. Tell me about religion. You started off as quite an
How long have you got? It's a big subject.
I know it is, but just to finish on it, I mean, obviously, you know, your life has been one of changing your beliefs, which is a kind of a great thing to witness, and you can probably offer some perspective that no. But, you know, I've been speaking with a bunch of people in America who are probably conservatives and having discussions about the left and liberals, and something I never thought of before, but most of them believe that when the Founding Fathers started America, that the structure of religion was one of the key components in all of this working. And they said without it, it's never going to work on its own. And I had never really pondered that until I started talking to them. And I'm curious what you think.
Well, that's a simple Burkean point, isn't it? If men are not prepared to put restraints on themselves from within, which have to be based on religious precepts, then they will have more and more restraints placed on them from without. And a lot of what we see in this crisis now is the triumph of fear. People are afraid, and people like being afraid more than they're prepared to admit, and also people like being told what to do more than they're prepared to admit. Freedom's not that popular. Fear is not as disliked as people like to let on. The great thing about religion is that it took fear, as I say, out of politics and out of society. Again, Edmund Burke, a man who truly fears God will fear nothing else. And if you genuinely believe, or can persuade yourself that it's enough of a likelihood to bet on, that death is not the end, then your concerns will be wholly different. But once that idea has gone, and I think the 20th century in Western countries has more or less killed the idea that death is not the end and that God is supreme in the universe, then you're left with a gap, which is filled to a great extent by idealistic politics. And politics is to me, it's a sort of form of heresy from religion. People engage in it for reasons for which people would once have engaged in religion. They believe that the temporal world can be made, if not perfect, so near to perfect that it's worth a lot of effort to do it. And they become, you see it particularly in the man-made global warming movement. It has very many of the characteristics of a religion. These are people who believe very strongly that they know something really good and that they need to spread the word of it to as many people as possible, and that they will do an awful lot of good if they can achieve the triumph of that idea. It's easy to sympathize with that, and it's easy to see why people are captivated by it. I don't have any difficulty with that. But the thing is, it's fundamentally it has in the end to become involved with politics. Whereas religion takes these very, very powerful forces out of politics and out of the relations between us and makes them matters between us and God, and is in that way actually much less of a threat to people's freedom. My late brother used to go on about the celestial North Korea. But the whole point about North Korea is that it's here, it's on Earth. The leader is worshipped, his power is total, and the whole point about the celestial polity is that it's not on Earth. It permits you to have whatever political opinions you care to have, in my view, and it permits you to live your life within the understanding of its moral commands very freely. And if you actually abide by it seriously, then it makes it possible for the hand of government to be extremely light.
It seems like an essential human technology that worked for thousands of years, but now it's been phased out.
Well, it's an extraordinary. We do live in a very, very strange era in which we have, through enormous scientific achievements, utterly transformed our view of the universe. But in my way, in a mistaken way, in arguments that I try not to have with atheists, because they're often so very boring, I ceaselessly point out the fact that Albert Einstein was not an atheist. You know, he wasn't a religious believer by any manner of means, but he did not dismiss some sort of theist explanation of the universe, in that whatever the explanation was, it wasn't one that man could understand. It's a wonderful metaphor of a huge library full of books written in a language we couldn't read. And confronted with that, who could assert knowledge of subjects completely beyond us? So it's worth looking up what he actually said about it. One of the most intelligent things said about it ever, I think. But atheism, as I said, is actually political. It's an assertion of the power of man, and it's also turning away from this really, really frightening idea, as I say, that death is not the end. But the problem with that is that one of the things which struck me greatly when I was having the argument with myself about ceasing to be an atheist is that it's quite plain from any study of human society that there is no justice in it. Even in the best developed and most civilized of human societies, justice is fundamentally lacking. And yet we have this tremendous impulse towards justice. It's one of the things which we are driven by. We don't control it. So it seemed to me that sort of mathematically you had to extend the area of justice beyond this life for it to be workable.
So without religion, we'll never have justice, and we want.
Well, there is no justice, but the things. If you desire justice for others, then you call it down on yourself. And I suspect that quite a lot of atheists fear that there is justice in the universe and don't want there to be, and think that, as so many people do, when after all, this is a choice of belief about the unknowable. when they choose the belief that the universe is a random, chaotic accident with no significance, in which your actions have no meaning beyond their immediate detectable effects, then that's preferable to what they fear is the other thing, where the universe is meaningful, does have a purpose, and your actions, as G.K. Chesterton, who I don't much like most of the time, but he said one of the things about a religious view of the universe is that you understand that what you do here matters somewhere else, and that your understanding of your actions may, at the time you undertake them, be wholly wrong. You're seeing the pattern of the tapestry from the back rather than from the front. You're misleading yourself. And you have clever and charming and thoughtful atheists like Thomas Nagel, who will actually ask themselves, though they don't answer it, why is it that I so much do not want there to be a God? And this impulse, if you ever actually get it right with most atheists, they will claim, to me absurdly, that they have no power over this choice, that it's impossible for them to believe in God. Actually, anybody can believe in God if they want to. You just have to say that you do so. There's no sort of mystical experience necessary. But they say they can't, I say they won't.
Why is there a correlation of age in the appreciation of religion?
Well, that's obvious, isn't it? Death becomes more of a reality all the time. But I grew up in places where I went to churches with tombs with grinning skulls on them, and you walk through a churchyard smelling faintly of decay. I've always been conscious of the inevitability of death. There's a wonderful little wall carving in Norwich Cathedral. There's a grinning skeleton. He looks quite cheerful, but the words alongside say, "As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so shall you be." And in one of the St. James Garlic High, I think one of the great Roman city churches, as you walk out of the church, there's a great black tombstone slab. There's some details of whoever is turning to dust underneath it, and then it says in very, very deeply incised letters, "Prepare to follow." Sticks in the mind. I think most of modern cities and life is designed to avoid the fact that death exists. People don't see it anymore the way I did as a child. There's a wonderful line in Alan Bennett's best play, from which he's been in decline ever since 40 years on. Death is a telephone call from the doctor. It's in the same passage where he also says, "A butterfly is an event." That's the modern world.
We have a graveyard right here, Bun Hill Graveyard.
Yeah, yes.
I walk through it regularly. I always look at the graves and just think about the people in there, what they wish they would have done, what they could have done.
Yeah, well, many of them were quite notable, weren't they?
Yeah, William Blake is there. You mentioned your late brother Christopher. Do you ever imagine what he would be writing about, at Vanity Fair in the last 5 months?
I don't.
Okay.
I would not, for instance, if asked, have predicted he would respond as he did to September the 11th. I'm not even sure he would have thought it when it happened. In fact, he wrote the immediate piece that he wrote immediately afterwards is much more equivocal than he later became. I think it's impossible to predict the minds of other people, especially independent minds. And it's certainly none of my business.
You think
he has to be left where he is. I think there has to be a line drawn under. People, when they're not here, you can't presume to imagine what it was they would have thought or said.
And you stopped talking about religion with him before he
Well, it's funny, we had that ridiculous debate in Grand Rapids, Michigan, if debate it can be called. There's a funny thing about the debate. If you watch it, as some people do, it seems to me obsessively. It was a much better debate that we had in London some years before, which is far more of an interesting watch, because it was a much more interesting subject in the Conway Hall, which you can find. But if you look carefully, you'll see on more than one occasion I come down off the stage and sit either in front of the stage, or actually at one point I went and sat in the stalls. And the reason for this is I couldn't hear what he was saying. And with the sound system being such, it projected what we said out over the hall, but if you were standing beside him, you couldn't hear it properly. And he was no doubt in exactly the same position. But he didn't care what I was saying, because he was going to say what he was going to say anyway. I was interested in replying to what he said, so I cared about what he said. It was by that time, it was performance. He had it down to the whole thing was just a performance, and what I said didn't matter in the slightest. What the outcome of that was, I wrote with great pain and difficulty a book called The Rage Against God, which I very much didn't want to write and nearly gave up on several occasions, which was a reply to what he'd said that evening. And I sent it to him, and around about the time he sent me, I think it was Hitch 22, his memoir, and he said, do you want to talk about it now, or shall I say what I think about it when I get asked to review it? And I said, no, keep it for the review. Because both of us thought that somebody was bound to ask him to review my book. Nobody ever did. Because nobody wanted to give any publicity to my damn book, so they weren't. But he did say to me in an email which I've lost that bits of it had caused him to, how did he put it, stroke his chin. I think I got him on one bit of it, on his ridiculous claim that the Soviet Union was a religious society. I think I got him on that.
Do you miss him?
Of course I do, yes.
He really became to love America, didn't he? Really enjoyed being over there.
Of course, well, America embraced him. It was made for him. It was a stage big enough for his personality. And of course, the other thing was this great advantage English people with plummy voices have over there is we're accorded a status which we don't really deserve. I think he milked that. I think he became, it's very funny, although he adopted one or two small Americanisms, his accent became, if anything, more old-fashionedly English the longer he was there.
I remember he did.
Definitely a smart move, I think. If he'd developed an American accent, half the joy would have been gone. No, he loved it there. I mean, I loved it there too. I would have cheerfully gone to live there myself, but it didn't work out. It has a lot of joys to it. I'm not sure I want to be there now. Mind you, I'm not sure I want to be here now.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of putting in for Swedish citizenship.
I remember he did like a makeover piece for Vanity Fair one time. And
I don't think that was his idea.
Okay. What are you doing in 5 years? Are you still coming into London? Are you still writing your Sunday column?
Yeah, I still come in. I come in 5 days a week. I write as much as I can. I do as much broadcasting as I can, which is almost nothing now, because the major broadcasters more or less dropped me when it was clear I dissented on the COVID issue.
So that's it. You just don't get the call anymore.
I don't get the calls.
Like that.
Very occasionally, I had a couple, but apart from my weekly conversation with Mike Graham on Talk Radio, which has been a huge relief, it's been great.
Yeah.
Mike, who started out disagreeing with me very strongly and now largely agrees with me. I had a tiny cameo appearance on a BBC Radio 4 documentary, some newspaper reviews on Sky TV, and that's it, apart from one really good thing, quite strikingly good, which is a Radio 4 program called Any Questions, a weekly panel show on which I've been appearing now for nearly a quarter of a century. And they specifically called me up to come and talk about it. And when I went on, the presenter treated me with considerable fairness and justice and gave me a chance to say, that's been the one exception. I did at one point get invited to go on Newsnight to talk about face masks, and this will tell you something about my attitude towards that subject. I said, you've been not asking me on for 4 months, and now you want to ask me on to talk about face muzzles. It's not the issue that I want to talk about. I lost it in both ways. I was so angry with them that they didn't want to have me on. I didn't go on. I should have gone on. I now recognise that I shouldn't have lost my temper. But I was by that stage so angry with the BBC as an institution that I just preferred to give them a piece of my mind.
Is this going to change? Or
I don't think so, no. It had already been, the BBC had been becoming much more confident in its radicalism over the past 2 or 3 years, and I found that the calls had been diminishing anyway, but this accelerated it.
Do you have plans for more books?
No.
Okay.
It's very hard for me to get books published. I could bore you to death, but it's never been easy. But the interesting thing is, it actually, even though I have one quite successful book still in print after 20 years, getting anyone to pay any attention to any new ideas that I have, I just can't do it. Perhaps I should write a novel.
I can't tell if that's a
but
joke.
I think I'd probably have to publish it myself if I did.
Maybe. Have you found brand new fans in the past few months based on your column?
Readers. I don't want fans.
Okay.
The last thing I want. I get enough trouble from my late brother's fans who by and large haven't read him and are admirers. I don't want to be admired, I want to be read. I think I've got some new readers, yeah.
I think so.
I think more people have been prepared to pay attention to what I'm saying.
Yeah, you must have.
I hope they read the other stuff as well, because I'm not actually generally what people think I am.
Based on your column?
No, I think if you read the column, you'll see the same thing. It's written for a popular newspaper. It's punchy and direct and perhaps briefer than something I would have written, say, for First Things, where I might write a 3,000-word review, and in a newspaper column you've got maybe 3 or 4 items in 1,200 words. But no, it's the same thing. No, people imagine me to be what I'm not. Both people who think they like me and people who think they don't like me get me wrong.
Which is what?
I'm not going to go. There's a sort of caricature right-wing commentator figure, which some people who are themselves on what you might loosely call the right want me to be, and my enemies also want me to be. But I can't be, because it's just not me. I just am more complicated than that.
You have a style in your column that's kind of incredible, because you don't come off as an intellect in that. You are able to speak to kind of the everyman and yet still explain complicated concepts.
Oh, well, thank you for saying so, but I'm not an intellectual. I make no pretense of being one. I am a jobbing scribbler. I'm not, by the standards of my own age, I'm not at all well educated. It's the only good thing about the catastrophe of education in my country over the past 50 years is that it makes me look good. But if people were educated to the standards which were still held to in schools and universities 60 years ago in this country, it would be obvious that I was very poorly educated, which I am, and I don't make any pretense of being an intellectual. So people sometimes call me, and I say, no, it's absurd. It's just the pictures got smaller, as I think so.
And I didn't ask you, I might as well ask you about this. Yeah, America, there's an election coming up soon. What do you make of that? Do you expect things?
Despair. And the choice which is offered to people in modern democratic contests is so bad that it's insulting. And the coming American presidential election doesn't seem to me to be any exception to that. I am myself in favour of it. I know nobody will pay any attention, but I am in favour of a purposeful, organised abstention. I think that the only way to obtain a revolution in the parties, it's the parties which need to be revolutionised, is for them to be deprived of legitimacy. If both presidential candidates, for instance, got fewer than 5 million votes, then neither of them would be legitimate. The election would have to be held again. And it would seem to me that mass abstention is the only intelligent reaction to the choice that's being offered to the American people now. And similarly in my own country, the two political parties in there are so utterly ungifted with vision or intelligence or common sense or serious political responses to the problems of the age at home or abroad that they don't deserve to be there. And people should tell them so, but they derive their legitimacy. Legitimacy in modern societies comes from the number of votes they can accrue. And it's very easy indeed for people, if they so choose, to deprive them of that, but people won't do it. There's this absurd idea that voting is a duty. On the contrary, not voting is sometimes the duty, and indeed also the idea that that voting is itself somehow a thing which has been fought for. On the contrary, the greatest despots in the world have used voting, and indeed some of those votes for Saddam Hussein and some of those votes which the one-party states of the communist world used to get, they were, if not genuine, they were close to genuine. People turned out to vote for them. Indeed, if you failed to vote in Soviet elections, you got into trouble for the very good reason they wanted that legitimacy. The right not to vote, or rather, more correctly expressed, the freedom not to vote, is a very important one, particularly where your rulers are treating you with contempt.
But that's not going to happen anytime soon.
It should happen.
Right.
And I'm here to say that it should happen, and I urge people to consider it seriously, because I think sooner or later, the idea that every ballot paper should contain at the top a slot marked none of the below. It's no good having none of the above, because that means that slot is at the bottom where people have already made up their mind. There should be a slot that's none of the below. So I treat the candidates you're offering me with complete contempt. I don't want any of them. And if that happened, and if none of the below outvoted all the candidates, imagine the political revolution which would follow. So easy to do. Why don't we do it?
Gosh, we'd have to stop clicking on their headlines and following them on social before we'd ever abstain.
Well, there you are. I mean, there it is. I mean, if universal suffrage democracy is what we're stuck with, then that's the intelligent man's response to it.
Yeah. I always ask a few questions at the end. I'm going to ask you, Peter, if you could pick up a phone and call up the 20-year-old Peter Hitchens and give that young man some advice based on everything you know now, what would you tell him?
The following success secrets are only available inside the London Real Tribe, where you get exclusive access and insights from our high-performance guests on wealth creation, productivity, leadership, morning routines, health, and well-being. To join our tribe community, go to londonreal.tv/tribe. Now, let's continue with the show.
Do you miss living in Eastern Europe and that whole flock?
It was a wonderful experience to be able to go and see it when it was there. Partly, a lot of it is very beautiful and very moving, or if not beautiful, then at least educational. It was another landscape. It was a looking-glass world that most people never went to. It gave me some of the best education I ever had in my life. I can't be sorry that the people no longer live in the horrible material conditions that they lived in, or they're no longer oppressed, because it would be completely wrong of me. I'm glad I saw it when it was still there. It's a privilege that I had. But again, it's a privilege I can't fully share. I can try to describe it to people, but because I'm always bound to fail, I could never really communicate the lessons I learned from it, and the attachments, particularly to human liberty, which I developed having seen what happens when it's gone. I wasn't entirely unserious when I thought back at the time East Germany felt that the Disney Corporation should probably have taken it over and set it up as a theme park, allowing the people to continue to live as they had, so that the world would have a living museum of what a communist country was like.
My mom took me to Checkpoint Charlie in 1985, and I got a glimpse at East.
Didn't go across?
No, I did go, yeah. And it was, they were wearing bell-bottoms. I got served an imitation of Coca-Cola that had a head on it like a beer. And I saw the bullet holes in the wall, and it was like I was in a time machine. That was 15-year-old.
Yeah. Yes, it was a strange place.
But the people, I'm sure you had some good relationships with the people.
Well, it's. I never lived in East Germany. I lived in Czechoslovakia or Poland, but I lived in Russia, so it was different for me there.
Do you miss the traveling?
No. It was good while it lasted, but it was exhausting, and it takes a huge amount out of you. I'm glad to have put it behind me.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I imagine for someone who ended up being a sort of foreign correspondent, I'm the most unlikely foreign correspondent. I love being at home and going home. I hate being away. And I ended up being a foreign correspondent and living in foreign countries. It's absurd, but it happened.
And now it gives you the wealth of knowledge and the appreciation.
Yeah, sure, but I mean, I promise you that each time the plane took off, oh no, here we go again. The sooner I'm home, the better.
And what's it like being a grandfather?
I quite like it.
It's a good perspective, huh?
I mean, there's not much to say about it, really, is there?
Peter, I really appreciate the time today. I appreciate you kind of going back into your past and everything, and also talking about the present. You're one of the few voices in Britain that speaks his mind and speaks it against, all these multimedia.
Well, isn't that
outlets.
ridiculous? Why is it me?
It is you.
Why is it me?
Yeah.
I mean, of all people.
Couldn't
they have come up with somebody better? I mean, really and truly, it's a reflection on the others. I mean, where are they all? What are they doing? That's what.
What does it take? Does it take someone who doesn't care what the ramifications of speaking the truth are, or is it someone who's just used to speaking the truth for the whole career?
No
that
idea.
They're not going to stop.
I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, it just seems natural to me. But maybe that you had to be the 20-year-old Peter Hitchens to be the 68-year-old Peter Hitchens.
Yeah.
And the 20-year-old Peter Hitchens, I say, wasn't very nice.
Well,
maybe not being very nice is the clue.
Maybe it is. Yeah. Yes. Well, anyways, I appreciate you doing that. And I think a lot of people around the world do. So keep doing what you're doing. I know you will. It's an incredible column. And I hope we can keep talking and, keep doing your weekly things with Mike Graham. They're super important. I think a lot of people in America need this voice as well. So.
Well, don't be too nice to me. People will think you've been giving me a softball.
But Peter didn't ring the gong, so I'm still a bit disappointed.
Good, right? That's
But
something bad I've done.
But yeah, I appreciate the time today, and so that's it. If there's unless we missed anything.
Yeah, you missed lots, but that's a good thing.
All right. Well, I appreciate the time, and hopefully we'll see you again here on London Real.
Forward to it.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.